The moment Gideon Ashford crested the long, sun-scorched ridge and looked down at what should have been the most familiar sight in the world to him, he knew that the war had taken more from him than the 2 years of his life he would never get back. The year was 1867, and the plains of southwestern Kansas stretched out beneath a merciless August sky, the kind of sky that burned a man's neck raw and turned the prairie grass to brittle copper. Gideon had ridden nearly 300 miles from Fort Leavenworth on a borrowed horse with a cracked saddle, carrying nothing but a canvas sack, a Colt revolver he had not fired since Appomattox, and a deed to 160 acres of land that bore his name in ink, so faded it was barely legible anymore. He had folded that deed inside his shirt pocket, pressed against his chest like a talisman, like the one solid thing left in a world that the war had remade into something barely recognizable. He had thought about the ranch every single day he was gone. When he was crouched in the mud of Virginia trenches with his ears ringing, and the smell of black powder so thick it felt like cloth pressed against his face, he had closed his eyes and pictured the wide porch of the house his father had built. He had pictured the creek that ran along the eastern edge of the property, shallow and cold even in summer, singing over smooth limestone rocks. He had pictured the corral and the 3 live oaks that stood in a line beside it, and the way the Kansas sunsets turned everything amber and gold until the whole world looked like it was made of something precious. He had kept himself alive on those pictures. Now, looking down from the ridge, he saw smoke rising from the chimney of a house that was not supposed to have smoke in it. He saw a vegetable garden that had not been there when he left, neat rows of green pushing up along the south side of the house. He saw a clothesline strung between the porch post and one of the live oaks, and on that clothesline, flapping in the dry Kansas wind, were articles of clothing that quite clearly did not belong to any man who might have been hired to watch the place in his absence. Gideon sat very still on his horse for a long moment, one hand resting on his thigh, the other holding the reins loosely. He was 27 years old, lean in the way that 2 years of army rations and marching made a man lean, with dark hair that needed cutting, and a jaw that needed a razor and gray eyes that had learned to go quiet when something surprised him, because the war had taught him that surprise was often the last thing a man felt before something bad happened. He touched his heels to the horse's flanks and started down the ridge. The closer he got, the more details resolved themselves. The garden was larger than it had first appeared, and someone had done it properly, with rows of what looked like beans, squash, and tomatoes, and a small border of sunflowers along the near edge that served no practical purpose whatsoever except to be beautiful. The house itself was in better repair than he had honestly expected. The front steps had been fixed. He could see the new wood, pale against the weathered gray of the old boards. The shutters had been rehung on the east window that had always sagged. Someone had whitewashed the fence posts along the front. He pulled up in the yard, dismounted slowly, and looped his horse's reins around the fence post. He stood there in the dust, hat in hand, looking at the front door. It opened before he had taken a single step toward it. The woman who appeared in the doorway was perhaps 24 or 25, with dark auburn hair pulled back in a practical knot at the nape of her neck, though several strands had escaped to curl against her temples in the heat. She wore a blue calico dress that had been mended at the hem and a canvas apron dusty with flour. She was not small. She held herself with a kind of contained stillness that made her seem as though she occupied exactly as much space as she intended to, and not 1 inch less. Her eyes, which were a warm, serious brown, moved from Gideon's face to his horse to the sidearm at his hip and back to his face in a single unhurried sweep. She did not look frightened. She looked wary in the considered, practical way of someone who had learned that fear without information was a waste of energy. "Can I help you?" she said. Her voice was steady and clear with a faint soft quality underneath it, like water moving over sand. Gideon put his hat back on his head, more out of something to do with his hands than out of any particular social impulse. "I believe," he said carefully, "that you might be in my house." A beat of silence passed between them, the only sound the wind and the distant creak of the clothesline. "Your house," she repeated, not as a question exactly, but with the tone of someone turning something over to examine all its surfaces. "Gideon Ashford," he said. "This is the Ashford Ranch. My father built this house in 1851 and he left it to me, and I have a deed that says so if you'd like to see it." Something moved across her face then, not guilt, which he had half expected, and not fear, but something more complicated. She pressed her lips together briefly, then she stepped back from the doorway and opened it wider. "You had better come in," she said. "This is a conversation that should not happen in a yard." The inside of the house was clean and orderly in a way it had never quite managed to be when Gideon's father was alive, or in the brief year Gideon himself had lived here before his enlistment papers came through. There were curtains on the windows he did not recognize, simple cotton ones dyed a soft yellow. There was a braided rug on the floor he also did not recognize. The table, his table, the one his father had made from a single plank of walnut, had been scrubbed white and set with two mismatched chairs, and there was a tin mug on it and a book lying face down beside it, its spine bent with much use. There was a smell of something baking and of coffee and of lavender, which was such a startling contrast to the memories of mud and gun smoke and unwashed men that lived so recently in his lungs that he had to stand still for a moment just to absorb the ordinariness of it. The woman crossed to the fireplace and lifted the coffee pot off the hook above the fire without asking him whether he wanted any. She poured 2 mugs, set his on the table, and sat in one of the chairs with hers cradled in both hands. She looked at him with the directness of someone who had decided that honesty was going to be necessary regardless of how uncomfortable it turned out to be. "My name is Della Thatcher," she said. "I have been here for 8 months. I bought this property from a man named Corbin Vance in December of last year, paid $112 for it, and I have a bill of sale that says so." Gideon sat down in the other chair and wrapped his hands around his mug. The coffee was real, strong enough to stand a spoon in, and it was one of the best things he had tasted since before the war. He did not say that. He said, "Who is Corbin Vance?" "He said he was the land agent for this territory," Della said. "He had papers, official-looking papers." She paused and he saw something tighten in her jaw. "I was new to Kansas. I had come from Ohio with very little money and considerable necessity, and I was not as careful as I should have been." She did not drop her eyes when she said it, which he respected. Gideon set down his mug. He reached into his shirt pocket and drew out the deed, unfolded it with the careful habit of a man who had handled this piece of paper many times, and laid it flat on the table between them. She looked at it. He watched her read it, watched her eyes move across the words, watched the small crease form between her brows. "I was in the war," he said quietly. "I left in May of 1865. I had a neighbor, old Walt Deering, who said he would look in on the place. He died in the fall of that year, as I understand it from a letter his daughter sent to my regiment, but I did not receive it until this spring. There was no one else." He paused. "I did not know anyone would move in." Della Thatcher looked up from the deed. Her expression was still contained, but he could see the working of something behind her eyes, some internal accounting of a very difficult kind. "This man Vance," she said. "He took my money and he sold me land that was never his to sell." That would appear to be the situation, yes. She was quiet for a long moment. Outside, a meadowlark was singing somewhere near the creek, bright and liquid, and utterly indifferent to the complicated human difficulty being worked out inside the house. "I have nowhere to go," she said at last, not as a plea, simply as a fact that he needed to have in his possession before any further conversation could proceed honestly. Gideon looked at the woman across his father's walnut table and thought about all the ways the world had gone sideways while he was away trying to keep it from doing exactly that. He thought about the deed in his hand and the garden outside with its sunflowers along the edge. He thought about the steps that had been fixed and the shutters that had been rehung, and the whitewashed fence posts, and the curtains the color of afternoon light. "What was your situation in Ohio?" he asked. A shadow moved behind her eyes, quick and gone. "My husband died in the war," she said. 18 months ago. His family had made clear long before his death that I was not their preferred choice of wife for him, and after he was gone they were not shy about acting on that opinion. I had a small amount of money saved on my own. My mother had left it to me, and I used it to come west." She met his gaze. "I intended to be independent." "And someone robbed you of $112 and sold you stolen land." "Yes." Gideon folded the deed and put it back in his shirt pocket. He picked up his coffee mug again and drank from it and looked at the curtains on the east window and then back at Della Thatcher. She was watching him with that steady, serious, waiting patience, and he thought that whatever had happened in Ohio and whatever Corbin Vance had done to her, she had not been broken by any of it. She had been made harder in the way that good leather was made harder, more supple, more durable, not less. "I don't suppose you know where this Vance fellow can be found," he said. "He works out of Caldwell," she said. "Or he did. I have not heard his name since the sale." "Then we will need to deal with that," Gideon said. "But not tonight." He looked out through the west window where the sky was beginning its slow turn toward orange. "I am going to sleep in the barn tonight. You stay in the house. We will figure out the rest of it in the morning." For the first time since he had knocked on the door, though actually he had not knocked, he had simply stood in the yard, Della Thatcher looked uncertain. "You would do that? Sleep in your own barn so I could have the house?" "You bake something," he said, because he had just noticed that the smell of bread had grown stronger as the fire in the hearth settled, and the thought of fresh bread after months of army hardtack was enough to make a man say almost anything. "I would sleep in the creek bed for fresh bread." Something happened at the corners of her mouth then. It was not quite a smile. It was the shadow of one, the suggestion of one, the place where one would be if she decided to allow it. "It's cornbread," she said. "And I have salt pork to go with it if you have not eaten." He had not eaten since before dawn. "I would be grateful," he said. So on the first night that Gideon Ashford returned from the war to find his ranch gone and a stranger living in his house, he sat across from that stranger at his father's walnut table and ate cornbread and salt pork and drank 2 mugs of strong coffee, and they talked. Not about difficult things. Not yet. They talked about small things, the garden, which she had planted from seeds she had carried from Ohio. The creek, which she had not known was there until the spring rains and which she had been grateful for. The meadowlarks, which she had decided were the finest things about Kansas and possibly about America. She told him that she had taught herself to patch a roof by watching the way the shingles overlapped on a neighboring structure 3 miles east, and that she had made one significant error in judgment that had resulted in a 3-day leak before she got it right. He told her about the creek, and how it ran low in August but never entirely dry, and about the particular angle of the autumn light in this part of Kansas that turned everything temporarily magnificent before the cold came. They talked the way 2 people talk when they are carefully circling around the larger thing, feeling for the edges of it, learning the shape of each other before committing to anything more exposed. When the fire burned low and the night sounds of the prairie filled the darkness outside, Gideon took his canvas sack out to the barn, spread his bedroll on the clean hay. She had kept the barn swept. He noticed and lay on his back looking at the stars through the gap in the loft door. He thought about the deed in his pocket and the woman in his house and the garden with the sunflowers along the edge. He thought about Corbin Vance. He fell asleep thinking that Kansas was stranger and better and harder than he had remembered it, all at once. In the morning, he woke before the sun was fully up and found that Della was already awake and had the fire going and a pot of oatmeal on it. She had set 2 bowls on the table, which he took to mean she had decided to treat the situation as something manageable rather than something catastrophic, which he thought was a sensible approach. "I've been thinking," she said when they were both seated. "So have I," he said. "What are you going to do about the deed?" "Ride to Caldwell and find Vance," he said. "Recover your money if I can. Report the situation to whatever authority exists there, sheriff or judge, whoever handles land fraud in this territory." She stirred her oatmeal slowly. "And the property," he looked at her across the table. "You didn't steal it," he said. "You bought it in good faith. What was done to you was done by Vance. I have no quarrel with you." She looked up. "Most men would not see it that way. Most men weren't gone for 2 years while someone sold their land out from under them," he said. "I have a certain amount of sympathy for people who get cheated by a man with convincing paperwork." The corner of her mouth did the shadow of a smile thing again. He found, somewhat to his own surprise, that he was starting to like it. "I want to come to Caldwell with you," she said. "Why?" "Because it is my money," she said. "And because I have a description of Vance that will be more useful than your deed alone. And because I am not the kind of person who sends someone else to fight her battles." Gideon considered this. "I don't suppose you ride," he said. "I have a horse," she said, with a calm so absolute it was almost amusing. "Did you see the bay in the second stall?" He had, in fact, seen the bay in the second stall and assumed it was a horse that had wandered in. He had not particularly thought about where it had come from. "That's your horse." "Her name is Prudence," Della said. "She is steady and somewhat opinionated, and she will not be rushed, but she will get where she is going." "Caldwell is 2 days' ride," he said. "I know where Caldwell is," she said. "I came through it on my way here." Gideon looked at the woman across his father's walnut table and thought that she was perhaps the most self-contained person he had met in recent memory, which was a thing he found unexpectedly arresting. He had spent 2 years surrounded by men who expressed everything loudly and immediately, and here was this person who expressed everything quietly and precisely, and somehow the precision of it made each thing feel larger rather than smaller. "All right," he said. "We leave after breakfast." The road to Caldwell ran southeast through grassland that rolled and swelled like a slow green ocean under the August sky. They rode side by side, and the conversation that developed between them on that first long morning was the kind that surprised both of them, the kind that began with practicalities, the state of the road, the probable weather, the wisdom of stopping at the Peabody trading post for water, and moved by some natural current toward deeper water without either of them quite deciding to go there. She told him about her husband, Thomas Thatcher, who had been a good man and a bad soldier, meaning he was too gentle for what the war asked of him, and had suffered for it long before the fever took him in the winter of 1865 outside of Nashville. She said it with a steadiness that told Gideon she had already made her peace with the grief, had folded it into herself the way you folded a map, carefully, so it took up less space but was always there when you needed to know where you were. He told her about the war, not the parts that still woke him up at night, not yet, but the other parts, the strange camaraderie of it, the particular humor that men developed when humor was the only thing keeping them upright. The way you learned to find small pleasures, a fire, a dry pair of socks, a letter from home, with an intensity that peacetime never quite managed to inspire. "Do you have family?" she asked when there was a pause. "My parents are gone," he said. "My father died in 1863 while I was still in training at Fort Leavenworth. My mother had already been gone 10 years before that. I have a cousin in Missouri I haven't seen since I was 12. He paused. "The ranch was the family." She looked at him with an expression that was not pity. He would not have liked pity, but something more like recognition, the look of one person identifying in another a parallel set of coordinates. "The house was good when I arrived," she said. "Even empty as it was, you could see it had been built by someone who cared about it." "My father spent 3 years on it," Gideon said. "Every piece of timber mortised by hand." "I could tell," she said. "The corners are true. Most buildings out here the corners aren't true." He looked at her. "You noticed that?" "I notice things," she said simply. They stopped at noon beneath a stand of cottonwoods near a shallow stream, where they watered the horses and ate the biscuits and dried beef that Della had packed with the same quiet efficiency she seemed to bring to everything. The shade was not much, but it was something against the ferocious August heat, and they sat on opposite sides of a flat rock that served as a table and ate without speaking for a while, which was also comfortable in the way that silence between two people can be when neither one of them is filling it with anxiety. "Tell me about Vance," Gideon said. Della dusted crumbs from her apron. He was maybe 50, heavyset, with a mustache that he had oiled. He wore a black coat, good quality. He spoke very smoothly, the way a man does when he has said the same thing many times and knows exactly where to pause for effect. She paused herself, a real pause, not a performed one. "He showed me the deed. He showed me a letter from the county land office. He had a seal on one of the papers, red wax. It all looked entirely legitimate, and I wanted very much for it to be legitimate, which is the thing he was counting on. He knew you were alone. He knew I was alone and new to Kansas and anxious," she said. "He was skilled at finding that combination, a beat. I suspect I was not the only one." "That is my suspicion as well," Gideon said, "which may actually be useful. A man who has defrauded multiple people tends to have left a trail." She looked at him with a directness that had become familiar in a very short time. "You are calmer about this than I expected," she said. "What did you expect?" "I expected anger," she said. "You came home from a war to find your land sold and a stranger in your house. Most men would be furious." Gideon was quiet for a moment, looking at the light filtering through the cottonwood leaves. "I was in the war for 2 years," he said at last. "I saw a great deal of what happens when anger outpaces thought. I made a decision somewhere along the way that I was going to try very hard not to let that happen." He looked at her. "The anger is there. I just find that it works better when I keep it still." She looked at him for a long moment with those serious brown eyes. Then she said, "That is a sensible thing," and it sounded, coming from her, like something more than a compliment. It sounded like genuine recognition. They rode into Caldwell as the sun was dropping toward the horizon on the second day, painting the low buildings of the town in shades of copper and amber. Caldwell in 1867 was a town in the process of deciding what it wanted to be. The cattle drives were beginning to reshape the whole region, and the storefronts along the main street had that characteristic combination of the permanent and the provisional that marked a frontier settlement that was betting on its own survival. There was a general store, a livery, 2 saloons, a small hotel, a barber shop, and a building with a hand-painted sign that read Marshall T. Brooks Law Office. Gideon and Della rode to the livery first and arranged for their horses, then went directly to the marshal's office. Marshal Tom Brooks was a lean, sharp-eyed man of about 50 with a weathered face and a lawman's habit of looking at the door when it opened before he looked at anything else. He listened to what Gideon told him with his hands flat on his desk, and his eyes moving between the two of them with that particular quality of listening that has learned to distinguish between what people are saying and what they mean. When Gideon finished, Brooks leaned back in his chair. "Corbin Vance," he said. "You know him," Gideon said. "I know of him," Brooks said. "He is not the first complaint I've had regarding that name and that style of operation. He moves around, works the newly settled territories, sells land, collects water rights, all of it fraudulent." He looked at Della. "You bought land in December of last year from a man matching that description." "I did," Della said. "I have the bill of sale." She drew it from inside her coat. She had tucked it into an inside pocket with the same forethought that Gideon kept his deed against his chest, and laid it on Brooks's desk. Brooks examined it carefully, turned it over, held it up to the lamp. "Same handwriting as 2 other complaints I have," he said quietly, more to himself than to them. He set it down. "I'll wire the Territorial Land Office in Topeka. If Vance is still operating in this area, there may be a way to locate him. It will take time." "How much time?" Gideon asked. "Weeks, possibly, could be longer." Brooks looked between them. "Where can I reach you?" "The Ashford Ranch," Gideon said. "East of here, a day and a half by the post road." "I know the place," Brooks said. He looked at Della with something that was not quite sympathy but in the vicinity of it. "I'm sorry, ma'am." There are men in this territory who see the law as a suggestion rather than a requirement, and they tend to take advantage of people who are trying to do things right. Della held his gaze steadily. That is a failure of the law to protect the people it is supposed to protect, she said, without heat but without apology. Brooks blinked and then, somewhat to Gideon's surprise, he nodded. Yes, he said. It is. They took a room at the hotel, separate rooms. Though the hotel clerk's eyebrows suggested he found this unnecessarily complicated, and had supper in the small dining room off the lobby. The food was simple and adequate, pork stew and bread and more coffee, and the dining room was nearly empty except for a traveling salesman who was deeply absorbed in a catalog, and a pair of cowhands who were finishing their meals with the quiet focus of men who had ridden a long way and intended to ride further. Gideon watched Della eat and thought about the conversation with Brooks and about Vance and about the ranch and about all the things that needed doing. The summer was nearly gone and the fall work would come fast. The corral needed inspection. The root cellar needed stocking. The east pasture fence had been showing rust on the wire even before he left. 2 years of minimal maintenance would have compounded all of that considerably. You're making a list, Della said. He looked up. How can you tell? You have an expression, she said, like a man reading a very long ledger. He almost smiled at that. Almost. I was thinking about the ranch. What needs doing, he told her. She listened with complete attention, the kind of attention that meant she was cataloging the information rather than simply receiving it, and when he finished she said, "The cellar is already stocked for winter. I put up 16 quarts of tomatoes, 12 of green beans, and 8 of apple preserves from the tree along the south fence." He stared at her. "There's an apple tree along the south fence. A small one," she said. "I found it in May. It had been there a while, the roots were well established, but it had never been tended properly. I pruned it and it produced this summer." He had not known there was an apple tree along the south fence. He had lived on that land for a year and had not known. "I did not plant that," he said slowly. "It may have seeded itself from the Deering property," she said. "Or a bird." She looked at him. "It doesn't matter where it came from. It's there now and it produced well." Gideon looked at the woman across the table from him and thought about apple trees that grow without being planted and produce when they are found and tended. He thought that was a fairly accurate description of several other things. They returned to the ranch the following day, arriving as the sun was midway down its western arc, the light turning that warm and particular gold that he had dreamed about in Virginia trenches. The ranch looked different to him than it had when he had crested the ridge 2 days before. He could see now what Della had done to it, not just the garden and the repaired steps and the rehung shutters, but the smaller things, the way the yard had been swept clear of the accumulated debris of abandonment, the way the well rope had been replaced, the way someone had planted prairie sage along the north side of the house as a windbreak, because whoever had done it understood the direction the winter storms came from. She had taken care of it. He thought about that as he unsaddled his horse and led it to the corral. He thought about a woman who had arrived in Kansas with $112 and a fraudulent deed and had proceeded, entirely alone, to make the place functional and decent and better than she had found it. Not because she had any guarantee that it would remain hers, simply because it was where she was living and she had standards. He came out of the barn to find her already in the garden, moving along the bean rows with an empty basket, checking the plants with the practiced hands of someone who knew exactly what she was looking for. The late afternoon light caught the auburn in her hair and turned it to something that made it difficult for him to look away. He made himself look away. There was work to do. He spent the following week doing it. He started with the corral fence, replacing the posts that had worked loose in the winter freeze-thaw, restringing the wire with the methodical patience of a man who had learned in the army to work on the task in front of him rather than worrying about the 12 tasks behind it. He moved to the barn, patching the place in the roof that had clearly leaked. She had set a bucket. He saw the rust ring on the barn floor, and then to the east pasture fence, which needed nearly 40 feet of new wire. She worked alongside her own schedule, which was equally full. She kept the garden, did the preserving, baked bread twice a week with a small supply of flour she had been carefully rationing, and had somehow acquired. He did not yet know how 3 laying hens whose eggs she collected each morning with a serious efficiency that he found he liked watching from a distance. She was the kind of person who did everything with her whole attention. He had never known anyone quite like that before. In the evenings they sat on the porch his father had built, with the boards he had hand-planed and fitted himself, and the conversation that had begun on the road to Caldwell continued as though it had never paused. They talked about the territory and the cattle business that was beginning to change everything about this part of Kansas. They talked about what a man named Joseph McCoy was doing at Abilene, building cattle pens and a shipping infrastructure that was going to make the whole Great Plains into a thoroughfare. They talked about whether that was good or bad or simply inevitable. She told him about growing up in Ohio, the third daughter of a schoolteacher and his wife, in a house full of books and very little money. She had learned to read Latin before she was 8 because her father thought it was the foundation of everything worth learning, and she had learned to put up preserves before she was 10 because her mother thought the same thing about practical skills. And between the two of them, she had come out with a combination of theoretical knowledge and hard competence that had served her, she said, considerably better than any alternative she could think of. He told her about his father, who had come to Kansas from Kentucky with a mule and a set of hand tools, and a stubborn conviction that there was good land here for a man willing to work it. His father had been right, as it turned out, and the ranch that came from that conviction had been one of the finest things in Gideon's experience of the world. He told her about the way his father had worked, with that same quality of total attention that he recognized now in her. The way each thing got the full weight of the man's capability, because his father believed that anything worth doing was worth doing as well as you could do it. "He sounds like someone I would have liked," Della said, on one of those evenings, looking out at the prairie dark where the stars were coming in as thick and indifferent as they always were out here, far from any town. "He would have liked you," Gideon said, and then, because he had not meant to say it quite so directly, he added, "He admired competence." "Is that a compliment?" she asked, and the shadow of the smile was there, and this time it moved a little further toward actual. "Yes," he said simply. She looked at him for a moment with those serious brown eyes and then looked back at the stars. "Your father's house," she said quietly. "I want you to know that I treated it with respect. I did not know whose it was, but I could feel that it had been built with care, and I tried to match that." "I can see that," he said. "Everything you've done here, the steps, the shutters, the cellar." "I was taking care of what I had," she said, "even if it turned out I didn't have it." He looked at her profile against the stardark sky. "You did have it," he said. "You were defrauded. That is not the same as not having had the right to it." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That is a generous way to see it." "It is the accurate way to see it," he said. They sat in the quiet of the prairie night for a while longer, and then the conversation moved on to other things, but something had settled between them in that exchange, some ledger entry of trust that had not been there before, and they both felt it without naming it. 3 weeks after their return from Caldwell, a letter arrived from Marshall Brooks. Gideon rode to the nearest postal point to collect it, a general store at a crossroads 9 miles east, and read it standing beside his horse in the dusty yard. Brooks had located Corbin Vance. The Territorial Land Office investigation had connected Vance to 7 separate fraudulent land sales across 3 counties, and the marshal at Wichita had taken him into custody on Gideon's complaint. The Ashford deed was confirmed as legitimate, and the fraudulent sale to Della Thatcher was documented as invalid. Brooks had arranged for the territorial court to issue a restitution order requiring Vance to repay all proceeds from his fraudulent sales. The money would come from whatever assets could be seized from Vance's operation, which was, Brooks noted, more considerable than might have been expected. The man had been doing this for some time. Gideon folded the letter and tucked it into his pocket beside the deed, and rode back to the ranch with the particular feeling of a thing resolved, not everything fixed, not everything simple, but the larger injustice addressed, the fraud named and punished, the mechanism of consequence engaged. Della read the letter at the kitchen table twice. When she finished the second reading, she set it down on the walnut wood and pressed her hands flat on either side of it, and he saw her take one slow, careful breath. Then she looked up at him. "He will repay the money," she said. "Over time, likely," Gideon said. "Court-ordered restitution is not always immediate, but yes, Brooks is confident the order will be enforced." She was quiet for a moment. "And the deed," she said, "it is confirmed." "Yes. So this is your land legally and undeniably." "Yes." She folded her hands on the table and looked at them. "Then I suppose," she said carefully, "that we should discuss what I am going to do." He had been thinking about this since he had read the letter in the dusty yard at the crossroads. He had been thinking about it, in truth, since the first morning when she had set 2 bowls of oatmeal on the table. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. "I would like to propose something," he said. She raised her eyes to his. "The ranch needs work," he said. "Considerable work. More than one person can do efficiently, and I have 2 years of neglect to address before winter. You have made this place into something, the garden, the cellar, the repairs. I can see what you've done, and I know how much of it was your labor." He paused. "There is also the legal matter of my situation. I have the deed and a confirmed title, but I have very little else. My livestock is gone, I assume sold off during the abandonment. My equipment is minimal. I have some money saved from my army pay, but not enough to fully restock before winter. And," she said, because she could tell there was more, "I need a partner," he said, "and you need a place." He said it as directly as he could because she was a person who responded to directness. "I am proposing that you stay, not as a charity case and not as a hired hand. As a genuine partner in the operation of this property, with a legitimate share of whatever we produce." She looked at him for a long, assessing moment. "That is not a typical arrangement," she said. "No," he admitted. "The town would have opinions about a woman living alone with a man on his ranch," she said. "The town is 9 miles away," he said. "But yes, that is also a consideration." He paused. "I am not proposing anything improper. I am proposing something practical. But I understand if I'll stay," she said. He stopped. She met his gaze without flinching. "I'll stay," she repeated. "Because it is the most sensible thing, and because I am good at this work, and because I am not going anywhere on the strength of what other people might think." She paused, and a fraction of something that was not quite the smile but related to it moved through her expression. "Also because I have 16 quarts of tomatoes in that root cellar, and I am not leaving them." He laughed then. It came out of him before he could decide whether or not to let it. A real laugh, the first one in longer than he could immediately recall, and it surprised him with how easy it felt. It felt like setting down something heavy he had forgotten he was carrying. She smiled too, then fully, actually, for the first time. It changed her face entirely, opened it up the way a room changes when someone pulls back the curtains. He thought that smiling was something she had gotten out of the habit of and was finding her way back to, which seemed to him a thing worth encouraging. The autumn came in with its characteristic Kansas violence, a cold front that arrived in October like an announcement of everything winter intended, dropping the temperature 30 degrees in an afternoon, and rolling in clouds from the northwest that said, plainly, that summer was over and had no intention of coming back. Gideon and Della worked from dawn to dusk in the days before the first hard freeze, pulling the last of the garden, stacking wood against the north side of the house, banking the foundation with hay bales, checking every window and door for drafts. They worked well together. This was a discovery that pleased Gideon in a way that went beyond mere practical satisfaction. They had compatible rhythms. She was an early riser as he was, she planned as he planned. She executed with the same methodical thoroughness he had learned from his father. But they were different in ways that turned out to be complementary rather than conflicting. She saw detail that he tended to overlook: the slight rot in the window frame he would have painted over, the larder shelf that needed reinforcing before it collapsed under the weight of the preserving jars. He had a physical capability and a knowledge of the land that she was still acquiring. The way water moved across the eastern pasture in heavy rain, the likely behavior of the north fence in a freeze, the habits of the small herd of cattle he had managed to acquire on credit from a rancher named Patterson 30 miles north. They talked while they worked, and when they did not talk, the silence between them had the quality of something comfortable rather than something withheld. In the evenings, when the day's work was done and they sat at the walnut table by lamplight, she sometimes read aloud from the book that had been lying face down on the table the first day he arrived. It was Dickens, she explained. She had read it twice already but found it agreeable on repetition, and he found that he could listen to her read for an hour without once wishing she would stop. He also found, as October turned to November and the prairie settled into its winter gray, that he thought about her when she was not in the room. This was new. He noticed the shape of her hands when she was doing the morning preserving work, the focused attention she gave to whatever she was doing, the way she hummed very quietly when she was thinking about something else. She was almost certainly not aware that she did this, and the way she tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear with an automatic gesture that she repeated approximately 40 times a day and never seemed to notice. He noticed these things with an attentiveness that he recognized, after a while, as something other than the attentiveness of a man observing a business partner. He did not do anything about this immediately, because she had been a widow for less than 2 years and had been through a considerable ordeal, and because the arrangement they had was working well, and he was not interested in making it complicated on the strength of something he had not fully examined. He was a man who liked to understand his own motivations before acting on them, which the war had taught him in the most concrete possible way. But understanding does not always arrive on a schedule. It arrived, in Gideon's case, on a Thursday afternoon in November, when a sudden early storm came out of the northwest with no warning and turned the world white in the space of 40 minutes. He was out at the east pasture fence when it hit, and by the time he got back to the barn he was soaked through and the temperature was dropping so fast he could feel it happening. He unsaddled the horse, rubbed it down, made sure it had hay and water, and was crossing the yard to the house when the door opened, and Della was there with a blanket and an expression of such unguarded relief that it stopped him in his tracks. "I was watching for you," she said. She held the blanket out and he took it, and she ushered him inside with a practical urgency that was entirely characteristic of her, moving immediately to stoke the fire and pull out the extra blanket from the chest and push a mug of hot coffee into his hands, with the decisive competence of a woman who knew exactly how to deal with a man who had gotten caught in a November storm. None of this was extraordinary in isolation. What was extraordinary was the relief on her face before she had controlled it back into her usual composure. What was extraordinary was that she had been watching for him. He sat by the fire and drank his coffee and thought about that with a steady, warming certainty that had nothing to do with the fire. He waited 3 more weeks. He waited until the first hard snow had fallen and settled, and the world was white and quiet outside the frosted windows, and they had fallen into the winter rhythms of the ranch. The morning chores done fast against the cold, the long afternoons of indoor work and reading and conversation by the fire, the evenings with the lamp lit and the prairie dark pressed close around the house. He waited until it was clear enough to him that this was what he wanted and why, and that he was not confusing gratitude or proximity or loneliness for something that he would regret having named. He asked her on a Sunday afternoon when the light was coming through the south window at that low winter angle that turned everything soft and golden, and she was mending a harness strap at the table, her hands working with their usual neat competence, her face bent to the task with its usual complete attention. "Della," he said. She looked up. He found that the words he had prepared, which had seemed adequate when he had rehearsed them, were insufficient now that he was looking at her face in the winter light. So he said the plain thing instead. "I would like to ask you to marry me," he said. "Not because of the arrangement and not because of the ranch. Those would function the same either way. I'm asking because I find that I do not want to be in a world where you are anything other than the person I come home to." The harness strap lay still in her hands. She looked at him with those serious, warm brown eyes, and the expression on her face moved through something private and unguarded that he had not seen before, a kind of opening, like ice breaking on a spring creek. "I should tell you something first," she said. "All right." She set down the harness strap. "I am not the same person I was before Thomas died and before Ohio and before Vance and before Kansas," she said. "I am harder in some ways and softer in others, and I am certain that I am more difficult than I used to be, because I have had to learn to depend on myself entirely, and that tends to make a person less flexible." She paused. "I say this so that you understand what you are actually asking for." "I understand what I'm asking for," he said. "I've been watching you for 4 months." "And," she said, and the shadow of the smile was there, trembling on the edge of becoming real. "And I am asking," he said. She was quiet for a moment that seemed to him very long, and then she said, "Yes," without any qualification or elaboration, simply yes, as direct and simple and unadorned as everything she did. And it was the best word he had heard in 2 years of absence and homecoming and struggle. He crossed the room and she rose from her chair, and they stood very close together in the winter afternoon light, and he took her face in both hands with a tenderness that he had not known he had in him until this exact moment, and kissed her. She kissed him back, and it was as unsimple and as warm as she was, and the fire crackled in the hearth and the snow lay white and quiet outside and the world was, for the first time in a very long time, exactly where it was supposed to be. They were married in January at the church in Caldwell, a small ceremony with Marshall Brooks as one witness, and a neighboring rancher's wife named Mrs. Eliza Hartfield as the other. Eliza Hartfield was a stout, opinionated woman of 60, who had been one of the first settlers in the area, and who had taken a firm and positive interest in Della from the first time she had encountered her, which was in October when Della had ridden 9 miles through an early frost to ask about seed catalogs, and the two women had ended up talking for 3 hours over coffee and Eliza's blackberry jam. It was Eliza who had provided the 3 laying hens in the early fall, and Eliza who now stood in the church doorway in her best dress looking at the young couple with an expression of considerable satisfaction. "He is a good man," Eliza told Della afterward in the blunt and unornamented way she said everything. "Steady. His father was steady too. You will not have an easy life because life out here is not easy, but you will have a good one." "I know," Della said. She was standing beside Gideon in the cold January sun, her arm through his, her face turned up to the blue sky with a small, quiet, real smile. "I already do." Gideon pressed her arm against his side and looked at her in the winter light, and thought that she was the most remarkable person he had ever encountered, and that the war and the loss and the long road home had been, in their strange and terrible way, the path that had led him here, and that here was worth all of it. The winter that year was long and bitter, as Kansas winters could be, but the Ashford ranch was well provisioned, and the house was warm with the fire his father had built, and the wood Gideon had stacked, and the curtains Della had hung, and the accumulated energy of 2 people doing the work of keeping something alive together. They spent the long evenings reading. She read to him as often as he read to himself, and he discovered that having someone read to you by firelight was one of the finer things available to a man in this life, and talking, and in the silences between the talking and the reading, simply being companionably in the same space, which was a thing he had not known was possible until it was. She told him more about Ohio in those long winter evenings, stories she had not told him before, about her father and the books and the particular light of a spring morning, when you could hear the creek running high and smell the turned earth, and everything felt like beginning. She told him about her mother, who had been a practical and somewhat unsentimental woman who had passed those qualities to her daughter, along with the recipe for apple preserves, and a firm conviction that intelligence without application was merely ornamentation. She told him about Thomas, and about what it had been to love someone gentle in a world that did not reward gentleness, and about the grief of watching him struggle with the war's requirements. She told these stories with the same quality she brought to everything completely, precisely, giving each thing its full weight. He told her, in those evenings, the parts of the war he had not told her before. The things that still woke him up sometimes, not in screaming, but in a cold, quiet wakefulness that sat on his chest until the dawn came. The men he had known who had not come back, boys some of them, 18 and 19 years old, who had died confused and far from home. The moral weight of what the war had been about, and whether the thing that had been won was worth the cost, which was a question that did not have a satisfying answer, and which he had decided he had to live with rather than resolve. She listened without flinching, and without offering comfort in the easy, meaningless way. When he finished, she put her hand on his and held it, and that was the entirety of her response, and it was sufficient in a way that words would not have been. Spring came with that particular Kansas suddenness. Winter 1 week, and then one morning you stepped outside and the air was different, carrying something warm and green and promising underneath the cold. The prairie responded immediately, the grass turning from its winter brown-gray to a fragile, vivid green almost overnight, and the creek along the eastern boundary ran high and clear with snowmelt, singing over the limestone rocks the way it always had. Gideon and Della began the spring work with a shared energy that had something celebratory in it, as though the land itself was cooperating with something new beginning. The garden was expanded. She had saved seeds from the previous year's tomatoes and beans, and they added a section of corn and a row of beets, and at Gideon's suggestion, a bed of herbs along the south wall where the sun would concentrate. The small apple tree along the south fence bloomed in March with a completeness that Della said was the result of the pruning the previous year, and they stood together one morning looking at the white flowers against the blue sky, and felt the strange domestic pleasure of something growing that had been tended. Patterson, the rancher 30 miles north, came through in April with news of the cattle market and a young bull Gideon had been hoping to purchase on credit, and the two men spent a morning talking over the corral fence about the coming season while Della made coffee and listened with the quiet attention she gave to everything that had relevance to the ranch's operations. She had opinions about the cattle market, as it turned out, and when she offered one, Patterson looked surprised and then interested, and then, by the end of the morning, was addressing his remarks as much to her as to Gideon. When Patterson had gone, Gideon caught Della's eye across the yard, and she raised an eyebrow at him, very slightly, and he smiled. "He'll be surprised again in 6 months when your prediction about the October prices is correct," Gideon said. "Most people are surprised when a woman has correct information about commodity prices," she said without resentment. "I have found the best response is simply to be right consistently." "That is what I intend to tell him," Gideon said. "When you're right." When, she said. She was right, as it turned out, in October. The summer of 1868 was warm and productive. The cattle herd grew. The young bull proved his worth immediately, and the garden produced with the abundance of well-tended soil, and the apple tree along the south fence bore more fruit than either of them expected, enough for 8 jars of preserves, and a pie that Eliza Hartfield declared was very good indeed, which from Eliza was high praise. Gideon hired a hand in July, a young man of 20 named Samuel Crow, who had come west from Tennessee with the purposefulness and inexperience of someone who has an idea of a thing, but has not yet encountered the reality of it. Samuel was willing and quick to learn, and he slept in the barn loft as Gideon had done his first night, and was unreservedly happy about this arrangement because the alternative had been sleeping under the open sky. With Samuel's help, they managed to expand the east pasture fence and take on additional cattle, and by August it was clear that the first full season of the ranch's new operation had been successful in the practical ways that mattered. Not wealthy, not comfortable by the standards of the East, but viable, growing, with a direction that was forward rather than sideways. Gideon and Della fell into the rhythms of a life together that had the quality of something that had always been this way, which he thought was the highest possible recommendation for any arrangement. She still hummed when she was thinking about something else. He still made the ledger face when he was planning. She still noticed things before he did: the loose hinge on the barn door, the early sign of rust on the north fence wire. He still knew the land in ways she was still learning, the way the soil changed from the east field to the west, the best places to water the cattle in the summer heat. In September, she told him in her characteristic direct way that she was expecting a child. He sat very still for a moment after she told him, not because he was not pleased, but because he was experiencing the particular quality of feeling that is so large, it temporarily removes the capacity for ordinary response. Then he crossed the room in 3 steps and gathered her in, held her with his face in her hair, her hands coming up to press flat against his back, and they stood in the kitchen in the September morning with the light coming through the yellow curtains and the smell of bread baking and the sound of the meadowlark from the creek. And he felt something so complete and so solid, it was almost architectural, the feeling of a life being built to a plan that had turned out better than any plan he could have made. "Are you pleased?" she said, her voice slightly muffled by his shirt. "Yes," he said. "Are you frightened?" She thought about this honestly, as she thought about everything. "A little," she said, "but not predominantly." "That is the correct proportion," he said. She laughed against his chest, and he felt it all through him. The winter of 1868 was milder than the previous one, and Della's confinement, as the winter deepened, was managed with the same practical intelligence she brought to all difficult circumstances. Eliza Hartfield rode over twice a month with the experienced authority of a woman who had delivered 6 of her own children on the frontier, and had assisted at considerably more besides, and she and Della developed a rapport based on mutual competence and direct speech that excluded sentiment in favor of useful information, which both of them appeared to prefer. Gideon found that his anxiety about Della's health required management. He had learned in the war to control the anxiety that the Army had called the jitters, and that he thought of as simply the gap between what you could control and what you could not, and he applied that lesson here with varying success. He worried more than he showed, and Della, who noticed everything, saw through him completely. "I am not made of glass," she said one evening, when she caught him watching her carry a kettle from the fire with an expression he apparently had not been as careful about as he'd intended. "I know that," he said. "I have carried heavier things than a kettle," she said. "I know that too," he said. Then stopped looking at me as if I might shatter. He made an effort. He was not entirely successful, but he made it. The baby arrived on the 15th of February, 1869, in a manner that Eliza Hartfield described afterward as uncomplicated, and which Gideon, who was in the kitchen because Eliza had sent him firmly out of the bedroom with a look that allowed no argument, experienced as the longest 3 hours of his life. When Eliza opened the bedroom door and told him to come in, he crossed the room with his heart hammering in a way it had not done since Virginia, and found Della sitting up in the bed with a faintly triumphant expression and a bundle in her arms. "Come and see your son," Della said. He sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the small, pink, wrinkled, red-faced, entirely new person in his wife's arms. The baby had a quantity of dark hair and was, at this particular moment, profoundly annoyed about the circumstances of his existence, which Gideon found entirely reasonable given that those circumstances were new and confusing, and represented a considerable change from prior conditions. "He is angry," Gideon said. "He has opinions," Della corrected. He gets that from both of us." Gideon reached out and laid one careful finger against the baby's small fist, and the fist closed around it with the automatic grip that new babies have, the one that feels like an argument and a question and a declaration all at once. He sat very still, looking at his son's face, and felt the full weight of everything that had brought him to this moment. The war, the ranch, the deed, the road to Caldwell, the woman beside him in the winter light, and thought that life was stranger and more generous than any man deserved. "What shall we call him?" Della asked. "I thought James," Gideon said. "After my father." Della looked at the baby, then at Gideon. "James," she said, with the testing quality of someone trying a word to see how it fits. Then, with certainty, "James Ashford." "Yes." James Ashford was a loud, determined, curious, and entirely healthy baby who grew into a loud, determined, curious, and entirely healthy boy with his father's gray eyes and his mother's habit of noticing everything. He learned to walk in the autumn of 1869. Navigating the kitchen floor with the purposeful instability of someone who has decided that the obstacle of not yet being able to walk is a temporary administrative problem. By his second winter, he was following Gideon to the barn with the single-minded devotion of a small human who has identified his father as the most interesting thing available for observation. The ranch in those years of the late 1860s and early 1870s grew steadily, expanding as the cattle business in Kansas expanded, as the trails north from Texas brought more cattle through the territory, and the markets at Abilene, and then Wichita rewarded those who had positioned themselves correctly. Gideon was not a man who made large bets, but he made careful ones, and Della's judgment, which she offered without flourish but with consistent accuracy, was as much a part of the operation's success as the land or the livestock. Samuel Crow became a permanent hand, and in 1870 they hired a second man, an older former Army scout named Harris Webb, who had come west along the Santa Fe Trail in the 50s and knew the land and weather with the earned intimacy of long experience. Webb and Della had an immediate and mutual respect based on the fact that both of them were people who said what they meant and meant what they said and had no patience for the opposite. And Webb told Gideon privately that the woman he had married was the sharpest person on any ranch within 100 miles, which Gideon received with a nod and a quiet and private satisfaction. In the spring of 1870, a letter arrived from the territorial court at Topeka, confirming that the restitution order in the Vance case had produced a partial payment, $64.30, slightly more than half of Della's original $112. Vance himself was serving a 3-year sentence for land fraud and forgery, one of several such sentences he had collected from different counties, as the full scope of his operations had come to light over the previous 2 years. The letter was clinical and bureaucratic in the way legal correspondence tends to be, and Della read it at the table and then folded it and set it aside with a completeness that told Gideon she was done with that particular chapter. "Are you satisfied?" he asked. "Justice is rarely complete," she said, "but it was present, which is more than many people get." She looked at him across the table. "I am satisfied." He reached across the walnut wood and covered her hand with his, and she turned her hand over and held his, and they stayed like that for a moment in the kitchen morning light. And that was the end of Corbin Vance as a subject of conversation in the Ashford house. James was 2 years old when Della told Gideon, in the same direct way she had told him the first time, that a second child was coming. Gideon received this information with considerably more composure than he had the first announcement, though the size of the feeling was not smaller, and he kissed her with a thoroughness that she received with a laugh against his mouth. The second child arrived in December of 1870, a girl this time, who came into the world with a quality of deep contemplative calm that astonished Eliza Hartfield, who had attended enough Kansas births to know that calm was an unlikely opening position. The baby lay in Della's arms and looked at the ceiling and then at Della's face and then at Gideon's face with dark eyes that already had that characteristic noticing quality, and was not angry as James had been, but appeared to be filing information. "She is thinking," Della said. "She has been here 3 minutes," Gideon said. "It is never too early to start," Della said. They called her Clara, for no particular historical reason except that the name suited her, and Clara Ashford grew into a person who indeed began thinking early and never stopped, which made her the delight of her mother, and the intermittent bemusement of her father, and the perpetual exasperation of her older brother, who found her questions about the structure of everything from fence building to weather patterns to the behavior of cattle to be both impressive and exhausting. The ranch through the early 1870s was not without its difficulties. A drought in the summer of 1871 hit the grass hard and required emergency rotation of the cattle to the north pastures and a costly purchase of supplementary feed. A hard winter in 1872 took 2 animals and kept the family inside for 3 weeks during the worst of it, a confinement that tested everyone's patience in ways that required management. And the broader changes in the territory, the influx of settlers, the expansion of the cattle business, the increasing conflict between the interests of ranchers and farmers, and the rights of the native peoples who had lived on these plains for generations, created a shifting landscape of social and economic tension that could be felt even on a ranch as relatively isolated as the Ashford place. Gideon watched the treatment of the Cheyenne and Osage peoples in the territory with a discomfort that he did not keep to himself, which was not a common position among ranchers, and which occasioned some friction with neighbors who saw the matter differently. Della shared his view, held it with the same quiet firmness with which she held most of her views, and they discussed it in the evenings with the honesty they brought to everything. The recognition that the land they were building on had not been empty before settlers came to it, that the displacement of peoples who had called this place home was an injustice that the government's policies made worse rather than better, and that their own prosperity was embedded in a history that had not been fair to everyone involved in it. It was not a contradiction they could resolve from a ranch in Kansas, but they did not pretend it was not there. They taught James and Clara about it as the children grew old enough to understand, because Della in particular believed that understanding the world accurately, even when that was uncomfortable, was more respectful than comfortable ignorance. In 1873, a man named Harlan Cross, who owned the adjoining property to the west, approached Gideon with an offer to purchase a portion of the east pasture, not the creek land, which Gideon would not sell under any circumstances, but a section of the upper pasture that Cross wanted for water access. Gideon and Della talked about it for 2 evenings, running the numbers and the implications, and decided to decline, but to offer Cross a water-sharing arrangement instead, a seasonal access agreement that gave Cross what he actually needed without requiring a land sale. Cross accepted, and the arrangement proved beneficial to both operations, and out of it grew a neighborly relationship that had not existed before. This was characteristic of how Gideon and Della approached the ranch and the territory and the community that was forming around them, with an attention to what people actually needed beneath what they were asking for, and a willingness to find solutions that worked for everyone involved rather than simply for themselves. By 1874, James was 5 and Clara 3.5, and Samuel Crow had become so embedded in the operation of the ranch that Gideon could not clearly remember what the place had looked like before him. Samuel had also, over the previous 2 years, developed a friendship with a woman named Ada who cooked at the Hartfield place, and Eliza Hartfield told Della with considerable satisfaction that she fully expected that friendship to produce a wedding before the end of the year, which it did, in October, in the same church in Caldwell where Gideon and Della had married, and to which Gideon and Della drove the wagon on a cold October morning with James and Clara wrapped in blankets in the back, and sat in the front pew behind Eliza Hartfield and felt the particular pleasure of watching something good happen. The ranch's 7th year, 1874, was in many ways its most successful. The cattle market held strong, the garden produced magnificently. The apple tree along the south fence had by now become a proper tree, its canopy wide enough to sit under in the summer heat, and it bore bushels of fruit that filled the root cellar and supplied preserves to Eliza and Cross's wife Margaret and several other neighbors. And the house itself, which Gideon's father had built with such care in 1851, had been added to and improved until it was solid and comfortable and entirely home in the deepest sense of the word. On a September evening of that year, Gideon and Della sat on the porch in the last of the warm weather, the children finally asleep inside after a day of considerable energy expenditure on their parts. The prairie was doing its late summer thing, the grass golden in the evening light, the sky enormous and clear, and already beginning to show the first stars at its eastern edge. The creek could be heard softly along the eastern boundary, singing its perpetual limestone song. "Do you remember the first evening we sat on this porch?" Della said. "Yes," Gideon said. "You looked at me like you were trying to decide whether I was a problem to be solved or a person to be known," she said. He considered this. "I was doing both," he admitted, though the second started winning fairly quickly. She laughed, quiet and warm, the laugh that was still one of his favorite sounds in the world, and leaned her head against his shoulder in the easy, habitual way of two people who have learned the geography of each other completely. "I was doing the same," she said, "trying to decide whether you were going to be fair or simply powerful." "And fair," she said, "considerably more than average." He pressed his lips to her hair, and she settled more comfortably against him, and the stars continued to arrive in the Kansas sky above them in their ones and twos, and then their thousands. "I have been thinking," Della said after a while. "What about the property to the east of the creek?" she said. "Cross mentioned that the Deering land is going to come up for sale in the spring. Deering's daughter is moving to Topeka and she wants to settle the estate." "I know," Gideon said. "I've been thinking about it too." "It's good land," Della said. "The soil along the creek is deep. We could run more cattle on it, or we could plant a portion in wheat. The rail lines are going to matter to wheat prices in 5 years, and this territory will be connected. You've been reading about the rail expansion." "I read everything I can find," she said, without apology. "The Deering acreage is 120 acres. With what we have now, that would make us the largest private holding between here and Caldwell." "That is not nothing," Gideon said. "No," she said, "it is not nothing." He turned this over in the quiet of the evening. He thought about his father coming to Kansas with a mule and a set of hand tools and a conviction. He thought about the deed in his shirt pocket and a woman in a blue calico dress standing in a doorway with serious brown eyes. He thought about apple trees that grow without being planted and produce when they are found and tended. "We will make an offer in the spring," he said. "I think it should be a fair offer," Della said. "Not an opportunistic one. She is settling her father's estate. She should receive what the land is worth." "Agreed," he said. She tilted her head back to look at the stars, and he looked at her profile against the night sky and thought, as he had thought many times in 7 years of marriage and the years before it of cautious beginning, that she was the finest person he knew. Not the easiest, she would have been the first to acknowledge that she was not easy, but the finest, the most complete, the most genuinely herself. "Gideon," she said, still looking at the stars, "yes, are you happy?" He thought about the question with the seriousness it deserved, because she had asked it seriously, and because it deserved a real answer rather than a reflexive one. "Yes," he said, and then because she deserved the full of it. "I came home from a war to find everything I expected to find was gone. My livestock, my income, my peace of mind. I found a stranger in my house and a problem I didn't know how to solve and a kind of desolation that I had not anticipated." He paused. "And then I found you, and the problem turned out to be the best thing that happened to me in 40 years of living." She was quiet for a long moment after that, and then she turned her face to his in the dark, and he could see the smile, the real one, the one he had first seen across his father's walnut table on a morning in late summer, and it was still the same thing it had been then, full and open and transforming. "That is the most you have ever said at once," she said. "It seemed worth the investment," he said. She kissed him, in the way she always had, completely, without reservation, with her whole self in it. And the prairie night continued around them, vast and quiet and full of stars, and the creek sang along the eastern boundary of the only piece of land that had ever been his. And somewhere in the house, James Ashford slept with the deep completeness of a healthy 5-year-old boy, and Clara Ashford slept with the contemplative calm she had arrived with and never abandoned. The offer on the Deering land went in the following spring, fair and straightforward as Della had specified, and it was accepted within a week. The Ashford holding became the largest between their corner of the territory and Caldwell, and they worked it as they had always worked everything together, methodically, with full attention and a consistent fairness toward everyone involved in their operation. In 1876, a third child arrived. A boy again, whom they called Robert, at Gideon's suggestion, after a man in his regiment who had been one of the better people he had known in the war and who had not come home from it, and Gideon thought it was a way of carrying something forward. Robert Ashford arrived in the world with his mother's auburn hair, and it became clear within the first year, his father's habit of going very quiet when something surprised him, which Della said would serve him well. James, at 7, received his new brother with the combination of competition and protectiveness that older brothers are heir to, and Clara, at 5, received him with an immediate and thorough analytical interest that expressed itself in a series of questions about the mechanics of new babies that kept Eliza Hartfield entertained for the better part of an afternoon. Eliza herself was growing older, and the rides between her property and the Ashford ranch had become less frequent, but she came in the spring and the fall and whenever the occasion seemed to call for it, and she sat at the walnut table and drank Della's coffee, and told both of them things they needed to hear with the unadorned directness of someone who has been doing that long enough to have gotten good at it. On the occasion of her last visit before a winter that proved too cold for old bones to manage the road between properties, she sat at the table and looked at the two of them, at Gideon with his gray eyes, and the lines that the sun and the years had put in his face, at Della with her auburn hair, still mostly dark though touched here and there with silver, still knotted at the nape of her neck with its characteristic escape strands, and she said, "You two came to this harder than most, and made more of it than anyone had a right to expect." "We had help," Della said, with a look at Eliza that was as clear as anything she had ever said. Eliza waved her hand. "Don't be sentimental," she said, but she was pleased. The years folded one into the next the way good years do, each one distinct and full of its own weather and its own difficulties and its own small magnificences, and yet seamlessly continuous, the way a creek is continuous even when the light changes on it and the season changes the quality of the water. The ranch grew, and the family grew, and the territory grew around them, Kansas becoming a state, and then the state becoming something more settled and fixed, the wildness of the frontier receding year by year before the advance of population and law and commerce. James grew into his father's steadiness and his mother's intelligence and became, by the time he was 12, a genuinely capable ranch hand who understood cattle and land and water with a fluency that took some men a lifetime to develop. Clara became the reader her mother had always been and surpassed her eventually, filling the house with books ordered from catalogs until Gideon built another shelf, and then another one, which he did without complaint because a house with books in it had always struck him as a house with a particular kind of wealth. Robert grew into his auburn hair, and his quiet, and the particular combination of stubbornness and gentleness that sometimes appeared when two very stubborn and not unkind people have children together. On a morning in the autumn of 1882, Gideon Ashford stood on the porch his father had built and looked out at the ranch. The long span of grass running to the eastern boundary, where the creek glittered in the October light, the cattle moving slow and peaceful in the north pasture, the apple tree beside the south fence enormous now, its canopy casting a wide shadow in the morning sun, the garden brown and harvested in its tidy rows, the barn standing solid and well-maintained. The house behind him with its true corners and its yellow curtains, and the smell of coffee coming through the open door. He was 42 years old, and he had lived in this place for 15 years with Della Thatcher Ashford, and he was, in the fullest and most accurate sense of the word, at home. He heard her step behind him before she appeared at his side, because he knew the sound of her step as well as he knew the sound of the creek, and she came to stand beside him with a mug of coffee in each hand, and gave him one, and looked out at the same view with the same quiet satisfaction. "Harris says the north fence will need a section replaced before winter," she said. "I know," he said. "I'll get to it this week." They stood together in the October morning, the coffee warm in their hands, the light doing the thing it did in the fall in Kansas, that golden, generous, temporary thing that made everything look like it was made of something precious. "The Deering land has been good to us," she said. "All of it has been good to us," he said. She looked at him with those serious, warm, familiar eyes and smiled, the real one, the complete one, the one that still changed her face entirely, still opened it up the way a room changes when someone pulls back the curtains. "Yes," she said, "it has." He put his arm around her shoulders and she leaned into him, and they stood like that in the morning light on the porch that James Ashford's grandfather had built in 1851 with hand tools and a stubborn conviction. And around them the ranch went about its morning business. And inside the house, their children were beginning to stir toward the day, and the creek ran clear and cold along the eastern boundary, singing over limestone rocks, as it always had, as it always would, asking nothing of anyone except that they listen. And they did, they always had. That was the beginning of everything, and also in the way that the truest things tend to be, its own kind of ending, not a conclusion but a continuation, not a finish but a form, like the deed folded in a shirt pocket that says, "This is mine, this is where I belong, this is the thing I came home to." Not the land alone, not the house his father built, not the creek or the apple tree or the cattle in the north pasture. Her, the stranger who had tended his house with more care than he had. The woman who had noticed the apple tree along the south fence and pruned it and let it produce. The person who had said yes with the simplicity of someone who means everything they say and nothing more and nothing less. The one who read to him by firelight and laughed against his chest and taught their children to see the world as it was rather than as they wished it to be, and who had arrived in his life through the mechanism of a fraud and a deed and a long road home, which was not the path he would have chosen, and was exactly the path that had led him here, to this porch, to this morning, to this life. Here was the thing about coming home from a war to find everything gone. Sometimes what replaced it was better than what had been there before. Not because loss was good, but because what grew in the space loss makes can be extraordinary if you are patient enough to let it, if you are honest enough to see it, if you are fortunate enough to find the right person standing in your doorway with serious brown eyes and a practical apron, and a garden full of sunflowers along the edge that serve no practical purpose whatsoever except to be beautiful. Gideon Ashford drank his coffee on his father's porch with his wife beside him and the Kansas autumn doing its magnificent temporary work on the world, and thought that this was enough, more than enough. It was everything.